Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on something really heavy but so important. You guys sent in this UN report on the conflict in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, and well, you want the real story, right? The human cost.
And that's what makes this report so crucial. It goes way beyond just numbers and statistics. It digs into the actual experiences of everyday people, doctors, patients, people detained, hostages caught in the middle of this conflict. Tough to read, definitely, but essential if we want to understand the true impact of what's happening.
Absolutely. So let's unpack it. One of the things that really jumped out, at least for me, was the section on the healthcare system in Gaza. The World Health Organization findings are honestly pretty devastating. We're talking 498 attacks on healthcare facilities in Gaza in just a 9-month period.
It's almost unfathomable, right? 498 attacks in 9 months. Think about what that means practically every single day. Medical professionals, people who are just trying to help, and patients, they're living under the constant threat of violence. And the report doesn't mince words, calling these attacks widespread and systematic. Airstrikes, sieges on hospitals, blocking essential medical supplies. It paints a very clear picture of a healthcare system that's under constant assault.
And what struck me was how this report brings those attacks to life through the voices of the people who experienced them firsthand. There's this one doctor they described trying to treat children with hardly any supplies. I mean, can you imagine?
It's unimaginable. And it's not just the immediate danger. Another doctor talked about the terrible sanitation issues in these hospitals because of the siege leading to infections and complications. Like, they're trying to save lives with one hand tied behind their backs.
And it just has this ripple effect, right? The report really drives home the long-term consequences for health, particularly for mothers and kids.
Yeah, you take a healthcare system that's already stretched thin, then devastate it with these attacks, it's a recipe for disaster. We're talking about generations being impacted by this.
And this is where it gets even more difficult to talk about. The report goes into the destruction of the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital. This was the only dedicated cancer hospital in all of Gaza, and now it's gone, completely destroyed.
This, for me, is where the real cost of this conflict becomes crystal clear. Not only was this essential facility destroyed in an airstrike, the report says that Israeli security forces then occupied the site and, get this, used it as a military base.
I don't even know what to say to that.
They have satellite images, social media posts showing Israeli vehicles and personnel at the hospital after the attack.
That's just devastating. And the Turkish government, they condemned the attack. They'd actually funded the hospital, even said they shared its location with Israeli forces beforehand.
It definitely raises a lot of questions. And that leads us to this whole issue of hospitals being used for military purposes. The report acknowledges the claims made by Israeli forces that Hamas was using hospitals as command centers, storing weapons, even holding hostages.
And this is a big but, the UN Commission says that they couldn't independently verify any of those claims.
Exactly. And while the report doesn't outright say the claims are false, it does highlight the fact that Israeli authorities haven't provided concrete evidence to support their accusations. It's a nuanced point, for sure, but really important to keep in mind as we navigate this incredibly complex situation.
And it gets even more complicated when you consider that the report states the Commission did find evidence of Israeli security forces vehicles, some even linked to transporting hostages, being present at Shifa Hospital.
It's a tangled web, no doubt. But the report makes one thing very clear. Regardless of any accusations against Hamas, at the time these attacks occurred, those hospitals were entitled to protection under international humanitarian law.
Leaving us with a very complicated picture, with these devastating attacks on hospitals, allegations flying back and forth, and ultimately, it's the civilians who are caught right in the middle of it all.
And it's not just hospitals. This pattern of civilians bearing the brunt of the conflict, it's everywhere. The report takes a really dark turn when it gets into the treatment of detainees on both sides.
Yeah, this section was really tough to stomach. And we're not just talking about, like, soldiers captured on the battlefield, right? The report says journalists, aid workers, even UN staff were detained. Thousands.
Thousands. It's just this massive sweep. And the report uses the phrase arbitrary detention, which basically means a lot of these people were being held without any clear charges, no access to a lawyer or anything. Pretty unsettling.
Right, and then you get into the accounts of how these detainees were treated. Beatings, sleep deprivation, just horrific hygiene conditions. The report even details allegations of sexual violence being used as an interrogation tactic.
It's really disturbing stuff, and it points to this larger systemic problem, not just a few isolated incidents. The case of Dr. Adnan al-Bursh is particularly awful.
He was that well-respected doctor from Gaza. Yeah.
Yeah, he was arrested, and there are allegations he was abused in custody and then later died in an Israeli prison. It's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And the report makes it clear that his experience, sadly, wasn't unique.
Makes you wonder how many other stories are out there, how many names we'll never know.
Absolutely. And then you add in the experiences of children being held in these detention centers. It's just heartbreaking.
The report talks about kids, some as young as 12 or 13 years old, being shackled, abused, some even held in the same cells as adults.
Yeah.
How can that be justified?
It's a clear violation of international law. And the report actually quotes this one 15-year-old boy who spent 23 days in detention. He called it the worst days of my life.
It's just awful. And then on top of everything else, you've got this whole hostage situation. The report says over 250 people were abducted by Palestinian armed groups taken into Gaza. Women, children, elderly people.
Just imagine the terror, not only for the hostages themselves, but for their families. The report really emphasizes the psychological torture of it all, the uncertainty, the fear, the way those hostage videos are used as a weapon, you know? It's psychological warfare.
And it's all happening against this backdrop of a full-blown conflict. The siege of Gaza just compounds all of it. It's just unfathomable. The desperation of those families cut off from their loved ones, not knowing if they're alive, if they're being treated decently.
And tragically, as the report confirms, some of those hostages were killed, some during Israeli military operations, and others while they were in the hands of their captors.
Yeah, there's a whole section about Sahar Baruch and Itias Versky. Their bodies showed signs of strangulation, lacerations. It's just horrific.
Yeah.
Honestly, feels like every page, every story in this report just reveals another layer of suffering. It's just awful seeing how vulnerable people always seem to end up paying the highest price.
It really does, and it just highlights how complicated this conflict is. I mean, the report acknowledges that Hamas use hostages as bargaining chips, putting those innocent lives directly in harm's way.
Yeah, and that just makes it even more horrific. And then, on top of everything, humanitarian organizations, like even the ICRC, the Red Cross, they have
Yeah.
such limited access. It's nearly impossible to grasp the full scope of what those hostages are going through, let alone make sure they're being treated humanely.
It's true. The report calls for accountability, for an end to the occupation, but acknowledges that there are no simple solutions, which I think we can all agree on. But even with all of that, it's so important to remember why we even dove into this topic in the first place, because why you, our listeners, wanted to understand the human cost of this conflict.
Exactly, because it's so easy to get bogged down in headlines and political debates, you know. This report, it forces us to remember the real story. The individuals, the families, whose lives have been shattered, futures are completely uncertain because of this conflict.
Right, and that's what makes reports like this so important. They bring those individual stories to light. These aren't just statistics we're talking about. They're real people, doctors, nurses, risking their lives every day, patients struggling to get even basic medical care, people trapped in detention, families clinging to hope.
Such a powerful reminder that the consequences of this conflict, they reach far beyond any sort of political goal. It's going to impact generations to come.
Without a doubt. And I know it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the suffering detailed in this report, but I think we need to sit with that discomfort. Let it motivate us to stay informed, to check our own biases, to demand better for the people caught in this awful cycle of violence.
We'll be sure to link to the full UN report in our show notes in case you want to learn more. I'll be honest, it's not easy reading, but it's something we need to hear. It's a reminder of the very real human cost of this conflict. And thank any of you for joining us for this difficult but so crucial deep dive.